Well, here you are. Glad to see I'm looking at the camera now, of course. Dr. D here in the studio, in the other studio. Looks like this is picking up a pretty grainy print here, or film, or whatever it is. Sequence. So I got another hat for you. You can sort of see the hairline if you like. Okay, yeah, but poetry. Marriage. No, actually, we are looking at poetry this week, and hope this is going well. Where are we on the threshold of week 6? Is that possible? I think that's lose track, don't we? But this is another little video to introduce the genre, the broad genre of poetry. So I hope people have been able to get started in that at least. It's good to kind of get rolling in the week, but not to get dispense with the work too quickly. Sometimes people jump right in and get it all done. But do make sure that you come back in at the end of the week to what's the word, to field like 5 or 6 different comments so you can reply to 5 or 6 different students. Now, we are a relatively small, high quality group now at this point, those completing the work. But a minimum 2 to 3 replies is nice. Otherwise, you do lose some points there. Because we definitely want to have a strong discussion board. And you learn most in these kinds of courses from the discussion board, in the discussion board. I think Arp and Johnson are quite strong in this discussion, as they are in many, many areas. So don't neglect to read the apparatus, the discussions surrounding the poems, because it's very, very useful to get all the terminology right and the approaches and possibilities. For example, speaker. It's essential to know what a speaker is in a poem. It's like a narrator in a story in many respects, but we call it the speaker is the person or the voice in the poem, and it's very different from the poet, as you can see. Sometimes it might share qualities of the poet, but we never want to say it's the poet's experience. I think that's a mistake to conflate poet with speaker in poetry. The discussion there on language is very important. The whole sense of how we use language to inform our audience sometimes, and in poetry it's quite different. Of course, it's a deeper, more richer, more varied and complex, sophisticated use of language. Not always sophisticated per se, depending on the voice we're adopting, but it is, a different way to read a text than to get the basic information, the literal. So poetry we read on the literal level, then definitely on the figurative level. Certainly, let's forget that. On 664, for example, you have that eagle there, and you get a sense of the experience of seeing an eagle, maybe even being an eagle. Look at the verbs. He clasps the crag with crooked hands. Close to the sun in lonely lands. Ringed with the azure world he stands. By the way, poetry does not really rhyme anymore. In the 20th century, 21st century, there's no more rhyming poetry per se. I don't consider a poem something that rhymes. To me, it's like rap or country western music, the lyrics or pop lyrics. They rhyme nicely because we like that sort of reassurance of the ring of rhyme. But this does, because Alfred Lord Tennyson, writing before 1892 when he died, is certainly a product of the 19th century and a great, great poet of Britain, the 19th century poet laureate, and wonderful poet. But we don't live in the 19th century anymore, right? Do we? So they get the clasps, the crag. We have the alliteration. So more important than rhyme is alliteration. Crest, crag, crooked. That's holy smoky. We have that sense of how poetry does give us imagery, very, very important in poetry. The way language presents us with the experience of the senses, visual imagery, what you see, auditory imagery, what you hear, tactile imagery, what you might touch or feel, olfactory imagery, what you might smell. More difficult to get, it's more difficult to write. Gustatory imagery, that which you might taste in some sense, and so on. Kinesthetic, is like what the movement and the feel of movement. But imagery is critical to poetry, so you try to get a sense of the imagery. But in this case, the language of alliteration, the repetition of consonant sounds, helps produce this picture, in a sense, the feel of the eagle, the experience of the eagle. Close to the sun in lonely lands, we got that. Ringed with the azure world, he stands. We can see the azure, the blue skies all around him. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. That kind of imagery, you can't get poetry that's better than this. This is as good as it gets right there. The wrinkled sea, you can see the waves. But rather than saying waves, Tennyson says they're wrinkled. The surface that depicts how the eagle sees, the distance from which the eagle perceives that surface of sea. We get the wrinkled sea beneath him crawls, and that kind of active verb. Again, the imagery, but also almost personification, if you will, or if we had the word for animalization, it doesn't really exist, but in that sense of giving the apparently inanimate object, like the sea, the surface of the sea, certain animation. Of course, the surface of the sea is not inanimate; it's quite animate. But poetry gives us that vivid portrait, the motion, the active life of the sea crawling. And of course, it's quite important for the eagle because he's looking for prey in some sense, or looking for something to dive down and grab. And of course, there it comes, right? He watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. This rhyme is good because these, stanzas that are in, what do they call them? There's a lot of technical business to poetry. We call prosody. We don't need to get too far into it yet. It doesn't need to ruin the poetry for you because it can get quite complex. But these are 2 stanzas of 3 lines each. So Tennyson is working in a way that's very tight. The form is very tight. So it has to do with the game that he's playing, shall we say, with this poem. But there he is, like a thunderbolt he falls. And you should know in that final line we have a simile, to the use of like or as, or appears or seems, to compare a couple of things. So we get that sense of how simile works. Metaphor tends to be more powerful. Crooked hands is kind of metaphorical because eagles don't have hands. I mean, they do and they don't. They have claws, right? So we say hands. You've got personification, but you also have metaphorical sense, like that an eagle's claws are hands. That's metaphor, isn't it? So in some respects. Mountain walls, also metaphor, because walls, they're not really walls, but they are and they aren't, right? But that's a powerful poem, and there are some questions there to tease out, and of course the authors Arp and Johnson do give us some nice discussion of that kind of poem. Winter, I think, there's a fair bit of discussion of that as well, to some degree. A wonderful poem demonstrating, as Arp and Johnson remind us, that poetry is not beautiful, but perhaps sometimes ugly. And that's the power, the revelatory strength and potency of poetry, is that it is ugly, And that's what you want. Greasy Joan doth keel the pot. This woman who's sweating in the winter because it's so hot by the fire, what have you. And she's been eating the winter food, kind of greasy and such. This poetry really captures us, the Shakespeare. So I'll skip through some of these, but I want to give you a taste of how I read them, certainly. And I can dip into the manual as well if it helps us. Maybe I will do that just to demonstrate the depth with which we can study poetry. For example, this is what Arp and Johnson, one of them, maybe it's Perrine, they use Perrine as well. Lawrence Perrine, says about the eagle. He says, the first stanza presents what one sees looking at the eagle, perhaps looking up at him, with the sun above him and the blue sky around him. The second stanza is more concerned with looking down from the eagle's vantage point. It presents what he sees. So you see the movement in the poem by stanza. The first stanza is more static, clasps, close, stands. Okay, I'll buy that. The second stanza more dynamic, crawls, watches, falls. So action in the second stanza. These are small points, but they help to organize the poem. The expressions mentioned in the first study question are all figurative expressions. There's your answer if you need that. Okay, good. Let's move forward. That gives you a taste of what they in that case, Perrine, the namesake of the book, Perrine finds. Hope you can see this grainy picture. It's kind of bizarre, but good. So moving, Dulce e decorum est. This is one of my favorites because it's such a powerful anti-war poem. It's one of the most powerful anti-war poems ever written, I would say, right? And look at the imagery in this one. It's critically important. Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge. This, like alliteration, but also the sickness, the ill imagery. It's ill. Yeah, it's sick. Not in the sense you're thinking sick, right? Till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. That's how poetry works, the poetic bloodshod, suggesting that the men are the shoes that they're wearing are the blood on the bottom of their feet, which is pretty horrible. But this is supposed to be a horrible poem. This is a poem showing the horrors of war, of course, and as we can infer, trench warfare, the Great War, early 1900s, the war to end all wars, which didn't do naturally, right? All went lame, all blind. So you can see the sickness imagery working there, right? Drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, quick, boys. An ecstasy of fumbling, this kind of perverse, sick sense of excitement, the horrors of running. Fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, gas masks, right? But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light. This is the perspective of a speaker who is in a gas mask looking out, kind of perceiving this horror landscape. As under a green sea, I saw him drowning. Here's your first person, right? In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. Thereafter, in the nightmares after the war, when the survivor gets home, he still sees this dying man, being consumed by gas or being suffering under the gas, the mustard gas or the horrible gas of the Great War. Next stanza. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face like a devil's sick of sin. And so if you hear the man trying to breathe in that line with the alliteration, there it is, right? It's a double meaning there, the sick of sin, but the sickness, the illness is there, but the sound, he's dying, right? His hanging face. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. And the Latin, of course, you've read its gloss there. Roughly speaking, sweet and right it is to die for one's country. No, it's not. Saying, no, it's not. Wilfred Owen is arguing against such false notions of glory in the horror of war, and that's about World War I. The Great War is pretty much when we took a turn to realize that war is not glory-filled. There is no glory in war. Whereas before that, we thought there was. Good. So that the imagery would be something you could really study that poem for, and look at how the sick imagery, the imagery of illness, functions in the poem to underscore and emphasize the meaning. There's a fair bit of discussion there. I'm sure there's some good discussion from the authors, the editors, but do take note of the boxes, and they help you to inform your interpretive efforts at reading these poems. And there's so many you'll find yourself inundated with poetry, but you've got to read these poems twice at least, and maybe read them in the bathtub or something. Try to relax. One student found that to be very, very useful, helpful to. You can't rush poetry. You must become a slow reader of poetry. It's that kind of depth. It's one of the best critical thinking activities in which you can engage. Right? Certainly as good as algebra, engineering, and such. So what shall we look at here? Just, I suppose. Well, Robert Hayden's The Whipping is kind of a powerful one, certainly. Page 671. The old woman across the way is whipping the boy again and shouting to the neighborhood her goodness and his wrongs. See, it's a different sense, that less crammed with the so-called poetic language, which we want to often avoid. Plain language is best sometimes, even though that seems contradictory. It's a sense of to get across clear experience, right? Wildly he crashes through elephant ears. These are the plants. But you see, there are strong verbs, right? Crashes. It evokes the violence of being beaten, a child being beaten or punished with corporal blows. Pleads in dusty zinnias. That's poetic for sure. Pleads in dusty zinnias. It evokes the specificity, evokes the experience. He's in these dusty plants. Pursues, while she, in spite of crippling fat, pursues and corners him. So this woman is heavy, overweight, and she's kind of struggling, almost killing herself to beat this kid. It's an obsession, right? It's a must-do kind of thing. She strikes and strikes at the shrilly circling boy till the stick breaks in her hand. His tears are rainy weather to wound like memories. That's interesting. It's a metaphor. The guy's tears become rainy weather to wound like memories. This would be the speaker of the poem, who is not the boy, but it could be the poet in this case, even though I say don't conflate those two. Often it can be a personal, what we call confessional poetry was big in the 50s, 60s, and thereabouts, the 70s, I guess, 60s, 70s, 1970s. And maybe they've come back a bit, but this is the poet or the speaker's memories, haunted by having been beaten himself, right? Or herself. The speaker could be a woman as well. Might be a boy in this case, right? My head, there you have the first person. My head gripped in bony vice of knees. There's your metaphor. The knees are being pressed into service as a vice, clenching this kid's head, right? The writhing struggle to wrench free, and there's your alliteration, writhing, wrench, writhing. It expresses the power, the struggling itself is expressed in the language. The blows, the fear worse than blows that hateful words could bring. So move from stanza to stanza. The blows, the fear worse than blows that hateful words could bring. The face that I no longer knew or loved. Strange sort of cryptic line there. But I think you get a sense what he's saying there is that when somebody's beating you, the face of love is gone. You don't, as a kid, you don't recognize that anymore. You hear somebody shockingly different coming at you. You don't understand that, right? There's the ellipses. Well, it is over now. It is over. And again, in poetry, when you have that tight form, that tight sense of the stanzas, just a few words to use, every word must count. Why would you say it is over? It is over. Because obviously it's not over, right? The speaker is trying to convince himself in some sense that it's done, but it's not. He's haunted by the beating. The beating lasts. As you well know, often what's more painful than the actual physical beating is the resonating emotional impact of a beating. And obviously this comes back again and again. It is over now. It is over. Of course, the beating of the big fat woman beating the boy across the way is over, but that also never ends because it's a recurring cycle, right? And of course, it's not over for the speaker because the speaker is feeling the memory of his having been beaten before, right? And the boy sobs in his room. And the woman leans muttering against a tree, exhausted, purged. There it is. Powerful sense of emotional revelation experience, purging. You can't get better than the word that's there, right? There it is. Avenged in part for lifelong hidings she has had to bear. And a great little pun there with hidings. Hide, to whip someone's hide, of course, but more importantly, things she's been hiding, which is like the emotional pain that brings you back to beat somebody else. And unfortunately, the recurring, the what do you call that? A vicious cycle, vicious circle. That unfortunately, those who have been beaten tend to beat others, which is horrible. That's the trap of abuse in which we find ourselves. So a very strong poem. And look at the stanzas. Each stanza presents a little scene, little horrible scene. This too is a wonderful poem in the sense that it testifies to the fact that poetry is not beautiful by any means, right? Poetry presents, to the contrary, the powerful human experience. Remember what William Carlos Williams said in his famous poem, of asphodel, that greeny flower. And he's writing to his wife, Flo, about his love for her. And he says, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. Which is to say, we can't get any better than poetry as far as philosophy, emotion, powerful intellect, important experience of human context, and it's presented to us in a way that's as Ezra Pound said too, the new literature is news that stays news. It's relevant. The Bean Eaters across the way is a good poem. Look at Agony, good poem. Dickinson is a wonderful, wonderful poet. She almost single-handedly created American poetry, along with Walt Whitman, I suppose, right? The godmother and godfather of poetry, or the grandmother and grandfather of poetry, American poetry, modern poetry, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, right? Okay, we're rolling along a lot of time here, but the bottom of the page there, we get William Carlos Williams' wonderful poem that shows you what you can do when he's borrowing from presumably the Eastern forms, the very clean, clear forms, and says the following: "So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens." And this poem has been analyzed to death, but it's a wonderful little vision, sort of a vignette. It could be many things, but it certainly is what we call an imagist poem in some respects. Imagism was something that Ezra Pound, a friend of Williams, sort of coined a term. It's where imagism is important. Pound's own poem is quite famous. It was one that he had 30 lines sitting near a metro in Paris in the 19-teens, I suppose, or 20s at the latest. And he boils these 30 lines down to 2 lines. It's a better 2-line poem than it ever could have been as a 30-line poem. And it goes like this. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bough. That's it. That's imagism. He just sees people coming out of the metro, in Paris, the original metro, and just says, the apparition of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bough. It says more than 30 lines could ever say, right? Imagism. A lot of great ones here, so it's hard to, I want to cut myself off, but Constantly Risking Absurdity, 674 and 5 is a wonderful Ferlinghetti. Show him jumping across the page, but also he's adopting William Carlos Williams' variable foot, where he moves down through the page to kind of present. Of course, Ferlinghetti plays with it a little bit to make his line work the way he wants to. Line ending is critical in poetry as well. Filling Station. Elizabeth Bishop is another wonderful American poet with some great stuff. The Fish, you'll see featured toward the end of our discussions, or end of our readings under, I think it's before Poems for Further Reading. It's in the section called Evaluating Poetry 2, poetic excellence. So this is a great, great work, The Fish, along with some other really wonderful works. So anyway, I think I wanted to say more, but the time just ticks away. I don't want to load too much. Billy Collins is a wonderful poet on 678 for his humor, of course, and its refreshing, simple language, but clever and delightful approach. And takes us through the chapter. Linda Paston as well. Is it Paston? Yes, Prosody 101, about how to read poetry. So poems that comment on poetry. There's a long tradition of that. Ars Poetica, is it called? Ars Poetica is Archibald MacLeish's famous work. A poem must not mean, but be. It's a line from his Ars Poetica. A poem must not mean, but be. Seems like a cop-out, but it's true. We don't look for meaning in poetry. We look more for the experience of the poem, the power, the music, the emotional force, the poignancy, the beauty as well. Great stuff. I think we'll sign off here in a moment. I just want to say that you support your reading of any poem with the lines from the poem itself, but just read it with a consciousness of the poetic, in the sense that you're looking for imagery as you become aware of what it is. You're looking for figurative language as you become aware of how that functions in poetry. You're really looking for line endings and how enjambment. Enjambment is when a line ends in the middle of a sentence and it drives you quickly down to the next line. Ironically, kind of quickly down, so you can't just, an end stop line would be a line that ends with a period. So you naturally stop there, or a semicolon maybe, right? But enjambment would be ending in the middle of a sentence, so you just roll down to capture the next piece of image of the sentence. So that's enjamming. A lot of terminology. There's more than you really need to get into, but you'll get into it because we have then also how to scan a poem, looking for the what do we call that, the scansion in terms of the beats, the pentameter. We know pentameter, which is the 5-beat line. Shakespeare's blank verse created this unrhymed iambic pentameter, which supposedly is the natural rhythm of the English language. I would argue that we probably have changed over the last centuries from Shakespeare's day in terms of our rhythms, but maybe he has something there, that there is. If you read someone like Wallace Stevens in Sunday Morning, you capture that natural rhythm of the English language, which is the unrhymed iambic pentameter. Da 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 da. So the poems like Stevens' Sunday Morning, she sang beyond the genius of the sea, begins that way, picking up that ancient, maybe not so ancient. Shakespeare's modern. It's modern English, right? In spite of what you might think. If you look back to Old English, you can't recognize it. It looks like Chinese or something. It looks like Greek or Finnish or something. Middle English you might recognize because it's Chaucer. When in April with the sure sutta, the root of March is pierced to the root, or something like that. That's my best memory of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the prologue. But in any case, Shakespeare is the beginning of modern English. So it's early modern English. So he's speaking in the way we speak, or writing the way we write. Probably long enough then for poetry to get us going. I would say, again, read it at least twice. The second time around, you're gathering how a poem really works. Certainly the one you write on for your explication, you want to read 4 or 5 times minimum to be able to get it line by line how it works, how it builds, how it concludes, and so on. There's a lot to be learned with poetry, but certainly want to enjoy it, the pleasure. I think it was William Carlos Williams also who said, if it's not a pleasure, it's not a poem, right? But there are many ways to look at these fine works. So enjoy, and we'll catch you on the flip side once again.